October 12th, 1978. The third shift at Ethelred Automotive Stamping is a symphony of groaning metal and hydraulic hisses. For 8 hours, Ethan Thorne feeds sheet steel into a press that punches out door panels for cars he'll never afford. The air tastes of hot metal and cutting fluid. The noise is a physical force, a constant, crushing pressure that leaves a man's ears ringing hours after he clocks out. Ethan is 32 years old, but the factory has aged him in dog years. His knuckles are scarred, his back aches with a permanent dull fire, and his face carries the gray pallor of fluorescent lights and sleepless nights. He's a single father. Every slam of the press, every hour logged, is for his 6-year-old son, Leo. But it's never enough. The pay is union scale, but union scale doesn't stretch. It frays. It snaps. The echo in Ethan's pockets is a constant companion. It's the sound of the gas gauge hovering on empty in his rusting Ford Pinto. It's the taste of powdered milk and day-old bread. It's the sight of Leo's worn-out sneakers, the toes scuffed through. A problem he solves with duct tape because new shoes mean no meat for 2 weeks. This isn't living. It's a high-wire act performed without a net. Every week is a new calculation of what can be put off: the electric bill or the overdue rent, medicine for Leo's cough or a new set of tires for the car that barely passed inspection. These are the brutal equations of poverty, solved in the pre-dawn quiet of a cramped kitchen that always feels cold. Ethan looks at his son, sleeping under a thin blanket, and sees a promise he's terrified he can't keep. A promise of a life better than this grinding, relentless struggle. The world Ethan occupies is a world of catastrophic failures. The number 4 press at the plant, notorious for jamming, cost a man 2 fingers last month. Management's solution was a new warning sign. His Pinto's transmission shudders violently on any incline, a ticking clock on a $400 repair he doesn't have. Everything is fragile, temporary, one small breakdown away from complete collapse. His only escape is the pre-dawn quiet of the Allegheny Woods, the one place where a man's skill can put food on the table. But even there, failure follows him. His hunting rifle, a surplus bolt-action, had jammed last week. A stuck casing. The buck that would have filled their freezer for a month had vanished into the mist while he fumbled with the bolt, his fingers numb with cold and frustration. The silent woods echoed with the same sound as his empty pockets. That single, critical failure crystallizes a lifetime of them. The unreliability of his tools, his car, his job, his life, it all coalesces into a single, burning point of focus. It's not just about a missed deer. It's about a world where nothing can be counted on, where a single faulty part can mean the difference between eating and starving, between safety and disaster. Ethan Thorne is not an engineer. He has no degree, no formal training in ballistics or metallurgy. He's just a factory worker with calloused hands, a high school education, and an intimate, painful understanding of what happens when things break. He looks at the rifle leaning in the corner of his apartment, a symbol of yet another system that failed him when he needed it most. And in the quiet desperation of that moment, a dangerous, impossible idea begins to form. An idea for something that won't break. Something you can trust your life with. Something that just works. The problem wasn't just the guns. It was everything. In Ethan Thorne's world, reliability was a currency he couldn't afford. It was the worn tire on his Ford that went flat on the way to the factory, costing him half a day's pay. It was the lathe he operated, a temperamental beast of iron and grease that would seize up without warning, its silence echoing the gnawing anxiety in his own chest. It was the promise of a steady wage that evaporated into medical bills for Lily's persistent cough, a cough that was the soundtrack to his every waking fear. The world was a machine prone to jamming, and Ethan was just another cog caught in its grinding gears. This philosophy of failure extended to the firearms of the day. He'd seen it firsthand. A friend returns from a hunting trip, his prize buck lost because his semi-automatic rifle jammed after the first shot, its action fouled by a single speck of grime. He'd read the articles in magazines, tales of soldiers in forgotten trenches, cursing weapons that were marvels of engineering on the parade ground, but became useless clubs in the mud and rain. The prevailing wisdom was one of complexity and tight tolerances, a delicate dance of finely machined parts that demanded constant cleaning and ideal conditions. To the engineers in their clean rooms, this was precision. To Ethan, who lived with the grit of the factory under his fingernails, it was a fatal flaw. Precision was fragile. The world was not. The idea didn't arrive in a flash of lightning. It was a slow crystallization of thought, a whisper that grew louder with every breakdown, every failure, every night he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the mounting pile of bills. The whisper began in the rhythmic chaos of the factory floor. He watched the massive stamping presses, hulking behemoths that shaped steel with relentless, brutal force. Day in, day out, they slammed down, coated in grime and running hot enough to burn, yet they never failed. Their secret was simplicity, a massive piston driven by steam or air, operating with loose, forgiving tolerances. It wasn't elegant. It was brutally effective. One evening in October of 1952, after a particularly punishing shift, Ethan was repairing a pneumatic hammer. Its action was simple. A heavy piston was driven forward by compressed air, struck its blow, and was forced back by a powerful spring. It was caked in filth, the seals were worn, yet it cycled every single time he hit the valve. He paused, a film of oil on his hands, and stared at the mechanism. A heavy piston. A long, powerful stroke. Ample room for dirt and debris to be pushed aside without impeding function. It wasn't designed to be precise, it was designed to work, no matter what. That night, the whisper became a voice. While Lily slept in the other room, her small breaths a fragile metronome counting down his opportunities, Ethan sat with a pencil and a sheet of butcher paper. He sketched the action of the pneumatic hammer. Then, next to it, he drew the bolt and carrier of a rifle. What if the two were one? The dominant design philosophy, direct impingement, siphoned hot, corrosive gas, directly into the rifle's delicate action to cycle the bolt. It was lightweight and theoretically accurate, but it was like venting a car's exhaust directly into its engine. It was inherently self-fouling, a design doomed to fail. Ethan sketched a different path. A simple gas port under the barrel would vent gas, but not into the action. Instead, it would push a long, sturdy operating rod, permanently fixed to the bolt carrier, just like the piston on the factory hammer. This single, rugged assembly would be thrown backward by the gas pressure, unlocking the bolt and extracting the spent casing. The entire mass would then be driven forward by a return spring, chambering a new round and locking the bolt. There were no small, delicate tubes to get clogged, no hot gas blasting into the receiver. The loose tolerances of the piston moving within its gas tube meant that dirt, mud, or carbon buildup wouldn't stop it. It would just keep running, a tiny, furious steam engine of reliability. He knew what the experts would say. The established gunsmiths and military ordnance officers were obsessed with balance and harmonics. They would argue that a heavy piston and operating rod reciprocating with each shot would throw off the rifle's balance, creating vibrations that would destroy accuracy. It was too crude, too agricultural, a peasant's tool, not a marksman's instrument. Their manuals, which he'd spent precious dollars on at a used bookstore, were filled with complex equations praising the elegance of designs that Ethan knew, instinctively, would fail when a man's life depended on them. They were designing for a perfect world. Ethan was designing for his world. The one where things broke, the one where a single failure could mean not having enough food for his daughter. This rifle wasn't just a mechanical concept, it was a declaration of independence from a world that had proven itself fundamentally unreliable. It was his one chance to build something that worked, something that would last, something that could build a future as solid and dependable as the steel he planned to forge it from. He looked at the drawing, then at the closed door to Lily's room. The doubt was there, a cold shadow, but the conviction was a fire. He would build it. He had to. Ethan Thorne's revolution didn't begin in a state-of-the-art laboratory or a government-funded think tank. It began in the damp, cramped corner of a Michigan basement, lit by a single bare bulb, smelling of coal dust and cutting oil. After 12-hour shifts at the stamping plant, after tucking his son Leo into bed with a story he could barely keep his eyes open to read, Ethan would descend into his sanctuary. This was the forge. His tools were not precision lathes and milling machines. They were a motley collection of hand files, a battered vise bolted to a splintered workbench, a cheap welding torch, and a drill press he'd rescued from a scrap heap. His materials were the cast-offs of industry. Rejected steel billets from the plant, leaf springs from wrecked automobiles, plumbing pipe, and discarded machine parts he'd trade for with other workers. He began, not with a grand design, but with a simple, burning question born of frustration. Why did things break? At the factory, he saw it every day. Machines designed by educated engineers, built with the finest materials, would fail because of one overly complex, fragile part. A seal would burst, a gear would strip, a sensor would foul. The entire line would shut down. Men would stand around idle. Production would stop. It was the same with the firearms he saw. The sporting rifles owned by his coworkers, the service rifles he'd read about in magazines, they were all intricate, delicate instruments. They were marvels of engineering, until a grain of sand or a drop of mud rendered them useless. They were built for a clean room, not for the grim reality of the world. For Ethan, this wasn't an academic problem. It was personal. His car, his furnace, his job, his entire life teetered on the edge of failure. He craved reliability. He needed it. For Leo, a tool had one job: to work, every single time. This obsession became the guiding principle for the rifle he called the Sentinel in his private notebooks. The name was a prayer, something to stand guard over his son's future. His first prototype was a disaster. He tried to adapt an existing action, hand-filing a bolt carrier from a solid block of tool steel. It was a brutal, month-long process of sweat and bloody knuckles. When he finally assembled it, the crude mechanism jammed after 2 cycles. It was too tight, the tolerances too precise. He had copied the very mistake he sought to correct. He threw it against the concrete wall, the crack of metal echoing his own sense of failure. But as he stared at the broken pieces, he didn't see an end. He saw a lesson. Complexity was the enemy. His breakthrough came from the factory floor. He watched the massive stamping presses, driven by relentless, simple mechanics. A long, powerful piston would drive the die, stamp the part, and retract. Over and over, thousands of times a day, covered in grease and grime, and it never failed. He sketched the concept on the back of a work order. A long-stroke gas piston, attached directly to the bolt carrier. No delicate, separate parts, just one solid piece of steel moved by gas tapped from the barrel. When the rifle fired, this piston would be thrown backward with massive force, like a battering ram, ripping the spent casing from the chamber regardless of dirt, debris, or fouling. It was an idea of brutal simplicity. He built the new gas system from a hydraulic cylinder he found in a junkyard. The bolt carrier and piston were welded together, a crude but powerful union. The next problem was the bolt itself. It had to lock into the chamber with absolute security, then unlock with ease. He found his inspiration in the chuck of the factory's industrial lathe. The way its jaws tightened with a simple rotation, strong, simple, effective. He designed a 2-lug rotating bolt, a mechanism so basic it felt almost agricultural. He spent weeks with his files, shaping the lugs, slowly carving the helical cams into the bolt carrier that would force the bolt to rotate and unlock. Each pass of the file was a whisper in the night, a sound he had to muffle with heavy blankets hung around his workspace to keep from waking Leo. The receiver was his greatest challenge. It needed to be strong enough to contain the controlled explosion of a rifle cartridge. He couldn't afford a forged billet. His solution was a testament to his resourcefulness. He found a thick, discarded axle shaft from a heavy truck. Using his hacksaw and a series of drill bits, he painstakingly hollowed it out, then spent over 100 hours with his files, shaping the exterior, cutting the channels for the bolt carrier, and drilling the holes for the trigger group. It was ugly, scarred with tool marks, but it was immensely strong. To heat-treat the critical parts, the bolt, the extractor, the firing pin, he used his home's coal furnace, judging the temperature of the steel by its color in the dark, quenching it in a bucket of used motor oil. It was blacksmithing, not engineering, guided by instinct and trial and error. Every decision was a trade-off, a sacrifice. The money for a new set of drill bits was money that couldn't be spent on a winter coat for Leo. The hours spent in the basement were hours he wasn't sleeping, leaving him a ghost during his shifts, running on fumes and sheer will. One night, Leo woke from a bad dream and came downstairs to find his father, face smeared with grease, holding a strange metal object. Ethan's heart froze. He quickly hid the receiver under a rag, telling Leo it was just a part for the car. The look of confusion in his son's eyes was a stab of guilt that stayed with him for days. Was he a father or a madman? After nearly 2 years of clandestine work, dozens of failed parts, and countless moments of doubt, he had a complete rifle. It was heavy, poorly balanced, and finished with cheap black paint. It looked more like a piece of industrial equipment than a firearm. On a cold November morning, he drove out to a deserted quarry. With trembling hands, he loaded a single round into a magazine he had hammered out of sheet metal. He chambered the round. The action felt gritty but positive. He aimed at a rusted barrel, took a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, slamming back into his shoulder. The bolt carrier flew back, the spent casing ejected, and the bolt slammed forward, chambering a new round. The click-clack of the action was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He fired again, and again. He emptied the entire 20-round magazine in a smooth, uninterrupted rhythm. The rifle didn't jam, it didn't stutter, it just worked. He stood there in the quiet of the quarry, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the cold air, holding not a weapon, but a promise. A future forged in the quiet hours. A revolutionary idea is not a revolution. It is a spark. To become a fire, it must survive the wind and the rain. For Ethan Thorne, the gauntlet had just begun. His blueprint was a promise, but the world demanded proof, and proof cost money he didn't have. Every dollar was a battle. A pound of chromium molybdenum steel, essential for the barrel's durability, cost him a week's wages. A set of precision calipers to measure tolerances to the thousandth of an inch meant 3 extra overnight shifts, his body aching with fatigue as he returned home to a sleeping son. He sold his father's pocket watch, the only heirloom he owned. He patched his work boots with scrap leather. He ate potato soup for dinner 6 nights in a row, telling Michael it was his favorite, a lie that tasted more bitter than the thin broth. Each component of the rifle was purchased with a piece of his life, a sacrifice laid on the altar of his conviction. His first attempt to show the world was a meeting with Arthur Vance, owner of a respected regional firearms manufacturer, Vance & Sterling. Vance was a man whose family had been making rifles since the Civil War. He looked at Ethan's calloused hands and oil-stained clothes before he even looked at the rifle. He held the prototype, its stock still rough-hewn, its finish unblued. It felt too light. The action was too simple. The bolt carrier group. There are only 8 components, Vance noted, a hint of disdain in his voice. A proper rifle is a complex instrument, Mr. Thorne, like a fine watch. Our Model 27 has 43 distinct parts in its action alone. That's what ensures precision. Ethan tried to explain. Complexity is the enemy of reliability, sir. More parts means more points of failure. In the factory, the simplest machines are the ones that never break. Vance waved a dismissive hand. Factories are not battlefields. This is a farmer's tool. Ingenious, perhaps, for a man of your background, but it lacks the sophistication required for serious application. Leave the engineering to the engineers. He handed the rifle back. The meeting lasted 7 minutes. Undeterred, Ethan believed the military would see the value. They were the ones who truly understood that a soldier's life depended on a weapon that fired every single time. In May of 1952, he spent 2 weeks' pay to crate and ship his prototype, along with 20 pages of handwritten notes and performance data to the U.S. Army Ordnance Department at Aberdeen Proving Ground. For 3 months, there was only silence. He pictured engineers in white coats studying his design, marveling at its efficiency. He imagined a letter arriving, a summons to demonstrate his creation. What arrived in August was a form letter, a single paragraph on government letterhead, its text cold and impersonal. Thank you for your submission. After a preliminary review, your design has been found to not align with current developmental priorities. The department receives thousands of unsolicited proposals annually. They never even fired it. His creation, born of sleepless nights and sacrificed meals, was now officially filed under unsolicited proposal, a bureaucratic dead end. The heaviest toll was not financial or professional, but personal. The workshop in his shed became a thief, stealing hours that belonged to his son. He missed Michael's school play because he was heat-treating an extractor. He forgot a promise to go fishing because a firing pin design wasn't working. One evening, Michael stood at the workshop door, holding a drawing. "Dad, look!" It was a picture of the two of them, stick figures holding hands under a yellow sundae. Ethan, his focus locked on filing a sear to a precise angle, just grunted, "That's nice, son. I'm busy." The silence that followed was heavier than any machine in the factory. When Ethan finally looked up, Michael was gone, and the drawing was on the floor. He picked it up and saw that his son had added something to the picture, a drawing of the rifle lying on the ground between them. It was a wall he had built himself, piece by piece, sacrifice by sacrifice. That night, sitting alone amidst the cold steel, holding the drawing, Ethan Thorne hit his breaking point. The experts called him a fool. The government didn't care. His own son saw him as a stranger. He looked at the rifle on his workbench, the source of all his struggle. Maybe they were all right. Maybe it was just a pile of metal, a monument to one man's arrogant obsession. He almost took a hammer to it. But then he remembered the shudder of the factory press, the sound of metal failing under stress. He remembered the promise he'd made to Michael, a world built on things that don't break. This wasn't about a rifle. It was about reliability in a world that offered none. The doubt didn't break him. It tempered him, like the steel he held in his hands. The gauntlet was not over, but he was no longer afraid of it. The rifle Ethan Thorne brought to the Aberdeen Proving Ground on a cold October morning didn't have a name. It was simply the Thorne prototype. To the ordnance officers in their crisp uniforms, it looked crude, almost primitive. The stock was hand-carved from salvaged walnut, the finish uneven. The receiver was machined from a block of steel Ethan had acquired in lieu of 2 weeks' pay. It lacked the polished elegance of the rifles submitted by the major manufacturers. It looked like what it was, a weapon born of desperation, not of corporate research and development. But its appearance was a deliberate deception. Inside, the rifle was a work of brutalist genius. The bolt carrier group had only 8 components, compared to the standard military rifle's 20. The gas system was a long-stroke piston design Ethan had conceived while watching a steam-powered drop forge at the factory, a system that used excess gas to violently eject fouling and debris, effectively cleaning itself with every shot. Field stripping required no tools and could be done in under 20 seconds, a time frame Ethan had perfected on his kitchen table while his son slept in the next room. Every feature was a direct answer to a problem he had lived. Complexity was a luxury a poor man couldn't afford, and a luxury a soldier in the field couldn't survive. The head of testing, Colonel Miles Vance, a man who had personally rejected dozens of revolutionary designs, picked it up. He noted the weight, the balance. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice flat with professional boredom, "you claim this weapon offers unparalleled reliability." Ethan, his hands calloused and stained with grease, simply nodded. "Yes, sir. It will fire, always." Vance smirked. "We'll be the judge of that. Let's begin with the standard endurance test. 500 rounds, as fast as your man can load magazines." The first magazine fired flawlessly. The report was sharp, the ejection consistent. The second magazine, the third, the 10th. The handguard began to smoke. The barrel glowed a dull cherry red in the overcast light. The shooter, a young private, glanced at the colonel, expecting the order to stop. Vance remained silent. They fired all 500 rounds without a single stoppage. The officers exchanged glances. Impressive, but not unheard of. "The water immersion test," Vance ordered. The private plunged the hot rifle into a 55-gallon drum of murky, sand-filled water. Bubbles hissed from the hot steel. After a full minute, he pulled it out. Water and grit streamed from every opening. "Fire," Vance commanded. The private shouldered the weapon, squinting, expecting a face full of hot water or a catastrophic failure. He pulled the trigger. The Sentinel roared, spitting a gout of steam and muddy water from its ejection port, followed by a perfect brass casing. It fired the entire 30-round magazine without hesitation. The silence on the range was now one of genuine surprise. Vance's expression hardened. The dust chamber, This was the executioner of firearms. The fine, talc-like sand simulated the worst conditions imaginable, designed to infiltrate every spring and crevice, choking a weapon's action solid. They placed the Sentinel on a rack inside the plexiglass chamber and blasted it with high-pressure air and sand for 60 seconds. When they opened the door, the rifle was barely recognizable. It was a solid block of brown grit. "No weapon has ever passed this test on the first attempt," Vance stated to the officers around him, a final dismissal. Ethan stepped forward. "Permission to fire the weapon myself, sir." Vance waved a hand. "Be my guest." Ethan picked up the sand-caked rifle. He didn't wipe it off. He didn't blow into the action. He simply slammed a fresh magazine into the well with a gritty crunch. He pulled the charging handle. It was stiff, protesting, but it seated the round. He aimed downrange and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The rifle cycled. The action, powered by that overgassed piston, violently threw the sand, grit, and casing clear. He fired again, and again. He emptied the entire magazine in a controlled, steady rhythm. 30 rounds, 30 explosions, 30 casings arcing through the air. The rifle fell silent. Ethan lowered it. The action locked open, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the chamber. Colonel Vance walked over slowly. He didn't look at Ethan. He looked at the rifle as if it were an alien artifact. He took it from Ethan's hands, his white gloves instantly soiled. He worked the action, feeling the gritty but functional movement. He looked at the simple, robust bolt. He looked at the wide clearances designed to shrug off debris. He finally looked up, meeting the factory worker's steady gaze. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something akin to awe. "My God," Vance said, his voice barely a whisper, "what have you done?" The U.S. military never officially acknowledges Ethan Thorne's full contribution. The patents are eventually sold to a major manufacturer for a sum that seems immense to a factory worker, but is a pittance for what the rifle becomes. The official corporate history credits a team of in-house engineers who refined a promising prototype. Ethan's name is relegated to a footnote in obscure technical documents. He doesn't seem to mind. He doesn't talk about the rifle. He takes the money, leaves the factory floor, and buys a small house with a yard. He sends his son, Daniel, to college to study architecture to build things that last, not things that break. His life's mission was accomplished. When neighbors ask what he did during the war years, he just shrugs and says, "I worked with my hands, nothing special." But the soldiers who carried his creation knew it was special. They didn't call it by its official designation. They called it the Sentinel. In the frozen mud of Korea, in the humid jungles of Vietnam, it became the standard by which all other rifles were judged. A 1,968 after-action report from the Battle of Khe Sanh, written by a Marine captain, contains a simple, powerful testament. Our standard-issue rifles were jamming from the dust and moisture. The Sentinels, however, kept firing, every single one. They were passed from man to man as other weapons failed. Those rifles didn't just win firefights, they saved platoons. The Sentinel's legacy is etched not in polished memorials, but in the lives of the men who came home because their weapon did not fail them at the critical moment. Its design principles, unwavering reliability over complex features, durability forged from simplicity, became the bedrock of American small arms philosophy for the next half-century. The very concept of a battle rifle that could endure any condition was redefined by Ethan's garage-built masterpiece. Modern weapons, with all their advanced materials and optics, still chase the ghost of the Sentinel's legendary dependability. Ethan Thorne died of heart failure in 1982, a quiet grandfather in a quiet town. His obituary mentioned he was a skilled mechanic and a loving father. It never mentioned he built America's most reliable rifle. But every soldier who ever cleaned mud out of a rifle that still fired, every son who grew up hearing his father's war stories, is a part of Ethan's true legacy. Remember Ethan Thorne. Remember that the most profound innovations don't always come from well-funded labs. Sometimes they are forged in the quiet hours by a desperate father. Remember that the greatest strength isn't always in the power to destroy, but in the will to protect.